All right, so let's continue our discussion of harmonic progression with just a quick little look at something that we haven't talked about much, which is what goes on in minor. Minor is always just a little bit different, but in this case, we're going to see that it's really, really similar. There's actually only one tiny little change. So it's worth looking at, but it's definitely not the kind of thing that we need to get overly concerned about. The bigger differences with minor that you're going to see represented here are, remember that the qualities of the chords are often very different. So, for instance, in a major key, we know that the 2 chord is minor. In a minor key, for instance, the 2 chord is diminished. Things like that. We're going to see a little bit of those differences play into what we want to talk about here. So I would highly recommend spend some time working on making sure you're super comfortable. But functionally speaking, these chords are going to work the same way, and that's very much kind of on purpose. You know, we look at the minor scale, we look at, we've got these 3 forms, natural, harmonic, melodic, whereas there's only that one form of major scale. It's often hard to understand why we have those, but in many ways, we're trying to make the minor scale function in the same way that major does. And we could argue about the positives and the negatives of that, but a lot of these changes are so that we can use a key in the same way that we would use any other key. Now, we are going to see one example here of some competition, I would say, between different forms of minor, but that's good, right? So let's take a look. It's always better to have more options for sounds to use. So let's take a quick look here. So talking about differences in minor in harmonic progression. So the biggest difference in minor is that there tends to be a much greater use of the 3 chord. And we should be able to pretty quickly guess why, right? So if we're in this key, I don't know why I decided to make that so pause-filled, but if we're here, 3 obviously has a Roman numeral name. But what is 3? If I'm in D minor, what's the significance of 3, which is F? Well, it's the relative major. And so being able to incorporate the relative major in a more significant way into the progression has obvious benefits because there's a clear sort of tonal connection there. So the 3 chord comes in, it's the relative major, and along with that, we also are going to see that we're not only using the leading tone 7 chord, right? The 7 diminished chord built on the leading tone. We're actually going to see that in minor keys there is a use of the so-called flat 7 chord, which would be based on not the leading tone. So if I'm in D minor, the leading tone is C sharp, right? And the 7 chord built on the leading tone is diminished. And we know that it's got that very strong dominant function because it's got the leading tone in it, right? So the 7 chord built on the leading tone, the diminished 7 chord, is a dominant chord. But we could use the flat 7 chord. So instead of a chord built on C sharp, what if we had a chord built on C natural? Well, that's a very different sound. And what we're going to find is that one of the reasons this chord comes into play a bit more in minor is, number one, because it's sort of hinting at natural minor, right? So in natural minor, D natural minor, D, E, F, G, A, B flat, C natural, that's the flat 7 going to Do instead of the leading tone, the raised 7, right? So got that flat 7 from natural minor, but also the thing about this flat 7 chord is that it leads via a circle of fifths relationship to 3. So if I'm here, let's say I'm on my 1 chord and I want to get to 3. Well, I can of course always just go 1 3 because 1 goes anywhere, but it's even more effective to go 1 7 3 because that circle of fifths relationship between, in this case, C, F, has a really, 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 really strong pull. So that's super interesting. So let's incorporate these ideas into the chart. And we can see we've got the core of the chart here that looks identical to major outside of the qualities being different, right? And of course, we should be able to predict that the same exceptions, quote unquote exceptions, are still in play. So let's just dig into this. So the first thing I said was, instead of the qualities of the chords being the way they are in major, right? So in major, for instance, 3 is minor. Well, in a minor key, 3 is major. Same with 6. This is a minor chord in a major key, but we're in a minor key right now, so 6 is major. You could do that all the way down the line. It's worth noting that the only 2 chords in a functional area that are the same are the 7 chord, the leading tone 7 chord, and the 5 chord, which is major. So the dominant area in minor is identical to the dominant area in major. And that's that idea of talking about trying to make minor work like major or have the same functional aspects as major. We can see that here. So that's one thing to point out. Thing number 2 to point out, remember that 1 can go anywhere. So we're in minor here. The 1 chord can jump all the way back to 3, and then we just head through our circle of fifths relationship before getting back to 1. Or 1 could go, for instance, straight to 4. And we could do a 4, 7, 1, leading tone 7 cadence at the end there. So 1 goes anywhere, and we've got our same exceptions. So we've got deceptive motion from 5 to 6. So here's 1. 5 could go to 6. Ooh, beautiful motion there before coming around to a real cadence. 4 can go to 1. That's a really nice motion in minor. Right, 1, 4, 1. And we can have the 3 chord go to 4, which then could go to 1. And we said that about 3 to 4 is it moves so nicely by step instead of a circle of fifths relationship, so it's kind of weak. And then 4 going to 1 completely skips over the dominant area, so it's weak as well. And we can hear that when we use these weaker progressions, it keeps the door open for the progression to last much longer, because these circle of fifths related relationships have a much more strong pull to them. So it's a nice way to mitigate that. So this is effectively the same chart that we had in major, just with different qualities of chords. But if we add this 7 on the beginning, as we mentioned on the last slide, it's got a whole new element to it, because we have 2 versions of 7. We have the leading tone 7, that's a dominant chord, and way out here in the hinterlands of the progression, we have the flat 7 chord. And the thing that I really love about having that is that flat 7 to 3, as we said, it has a strong circle of fifths relationship to 3, and I think we get such an amazing aural connection with the way this progression chart is built, because the motion to 3, the motion to the relative major, feels so distant from the darkness, the color darkness of the minor resolution, 5 to 1. Right? When we get a cadence in minor, whether it's a 2-5-1, it's a very big angst-filled, sad resolution, right? It really has a darkness to it. And one of the things that I love about the darkness of the resolution in minor is that 5 is major. We're on a major chord filled with potential optimism, but it's just an example of how major does not always mean happy, because in this major chord, we can hear the darkness that it's leading towards, which I just love. But back to this. The motion from 7 to 3 has this hopeful element and illustrates to us just how far away we are. And as we go through the progression, you can just hear how it darkens and darkens and darkens as I go. So I'm starting on 1. Here's 1, flat 7 to 3, and then I'm just going to go circle of fifths to 6 to the diminished 2, and we can feel the darkness of the cadence coming before we just are so far away from that happiness that we started with. So that's one of the beautiful complexities that having the lowered 7th, the flat 7, or sometimes just called the major 7 chord. That's one of the things that minor can give us here by having this 7, which leads so nicely to the major 3, and the leading tone 7, which is by far the more common option, but the leading tone 7, which leads to 1. Really a nice sort of way to compare just how influential the presence of the leading tone is. So leave you with that on this. But minor, as always, a little bit extra that you have to think about, but it's often for the purpose of a really rich, complex, expressive tapestry. And this major 7 chord really gives it that flat 7 chord. So that's how it is in minor. I'm hoping you feel pretty confident because it's essentially the same function-wise, just slightly different. So let's go forward and get moving on this.